Welcome to the Garage Gardeners Radio Show with your hosts Emma and Stephen Biggs, right here on Reality Radio 101. To get on board, send us an email. Our email address is instudio101@gmail.com. You're listening to the Garage Gardeners Radio Show, where we talk about extending the gardening season and pushing garden boundaries. We talk to creative gardeners and garden experts who share ideas about how to garden longer and grow plants you didn't think you could grow. Now, here are your hosts, the daughter and father duo, Emma and Stephen Biggs.
Hey everyone, I'm Emma Biggs, and thanks for hanging out with us today on the Garage Gardeners Radio Show. I'm a 13-year-old garden writer and speaker who loves growing tomatoes. I'm an extreme gardener who wants the garden season to never end.
Hey everybody, I'm Stephen Biggs. I write and speak about the food chain, farms, food, and gardens, and I'm a fig pig. One of my favorite plants is the fig. I have lots of fig plants around my place here in Toronto, and lots of other out-of-zone plants too. The challenge of growing figs in a cold climate helped me to see how fun the challenge of pushing zone boundaries is. Emma and I also think gardening is a great way to hang out together, and we're glad you're hanging out with us here today. Our show is all about extending the gardening season and pushing garden boundaries.
Now you're probably wondering where we got the name, the Garage Gardeners. Well, Dad and I both use our garage to extend the gardening seasons, because I grow heat-loving crops like tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants up on our garage rooftop, and Dad stores his dormant fig trees and lemon trees in our garage over the winter. Our garage helps us extend the season and store tender plants over the winter.
And I have to mention, today is a special day for us. Today's our 1-year anniversary.
Woohoo!
We started this show 1 year ago.
Congratulations, we did not know that. That shows you how we keep track of our records.
Thank you, Gary. Yeah, and it's been such a fun year. We've had so much fun doing this, so we're all excited about the upcoming year. Now, we're giving away a book today, The Canadian Gardener's Guide, 3rd edition. It's edited by Lorraine Johnson, who's our guest later in the show. This is a fantastic book. It has information about Canadian plant hardiness zones, design, choosing plants, building patios and fences, native plants, growing flowers, fruit, and vegetables. We've had the 1st edition since it came out in 2012, but this is the updated 3rd edition, and it's great. Now, our first guest today is Denise Schreiber. Denise pushes garden boundaries by introducing people to flowers they didn't know they could eat. Now, talking about edible flowers, I remember the summer that I learned about eating nasturtium flowers. I was a summer student at the Royal Botanical Gardens in Hamilton, Ontario, and I started adding nasturtium flowers on top of the salads that I was bringing to work. As I was sitting in the lunchroom I think it was one of the first days that I brought one, I mixed up a container of oil and vinegar dressing that I'd brought, and I dressed my salad. It was only as that first nasturtium flower was halfway to my mouth that I noticed the army of aphids marching around my salad. I guess they'd been hiding in the flour, and they didn't really care for my salad dressing. Quite surprised and a little bit embarrassed because my colleagues were watching me eat these edible flowers, I ate the flower and the aphids, knowing that my edible flowers had really intrigued them.
Dad, that is really gross.
Sorry.
Now, I have to say, when I sold produce last year, having heard the story before, I closely inspected the edible flowers that I was selling before giving them to neighbors, because I thought that may be the best choice.
Okay, well, if you want to connect with us, you find me at stephenbiggs.ca and Emma is at emmabiggs.ca.
And on Instagram, you can find us hanging out under the name Garage Gardeners. And if you're tomato crazy, like me, be sure to follow me on Instagram, where I hang out as emmabiggs_grows.
Now, in just a moment, we'll chat with our first guest for today, Denise Schreiber, and she's an author and horticulturist from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and she's also an edible flower expert. Her book is called Eat Your Roses. And it's thanks to Denise that I was inspired to garnish plates with flowers from my eastern redbud tree last year. I think Denise has inspired a lot of people.
Yeah, and I've had a lot of fun going through seed catalogs this year. Normally I just skip the flower section because that's more Dad's thing. But this year I went through the flower section trying to find all the edible flowers with so much advice from Denise's book. So that was really great. And so it was after that we chatted with Denise the last time and she talked about how she uses rose petals that I decided to do something special for Mom and Dad. So I went outside and I picked some rose petals. There were some that smelled really great, some that were variegated. It was pretty neat. And then I dipped them in melted chocolate. And it was pretty neat and a lot of fun.
Now, our guest in the second half of the show, as we mentioned, is Lorraine Johnson. She takes us down a really fun path with the idea of rogue gardeners who push the limits.
Yeah, and in every show we also have Tomato Talk with me and Bigs on Figs with Dad, the Fig Pig. And so today we're going to be playing a chat that I had with the gardening expert Jessica Walliser to get her recommendations for growing tomatoes in containers. And then for Dad's Bigs on Figs segment, he's going to be talking with Jack Spruill about a community fig orchard in North Carolina. This is just making me so hungry.
So send in your questions. Remember, we're giving away a book today, Canadian Gardener's Guide, 3rd edition.
Now let's chat with Denise. Hi, Denise.
How you doing?
Pretty good. How are you?
Good. A little chilly here today. Probably you are too, but we're supposed to be 60 degrees this Sunday, so I'm hoping for that.
Yeah, it's a little chilly here, but we're all dreaming of edible flowers, so it makes it a little bit warmer.
Yeah, we missed that big snowstorm that just came through here. We only got a couple of inches. Further east, they got a couple of feet.
Wow. Hey, well, Denise, we need to know how you got into edible flowers. I think you were on a trip and you had some inspiration. Is that right?
Yeah, actually, 2 friends and I had decided to take a trip to England and visit the gardens. So we got together and we got some books and I want to go to this garden, and this garden. We all picked different gardens. So we got to England. We taught ourselves to drive on the wrong side of the road in Gatwick Airport. And then, we headed out because we just stayed in bed and breakfast all over the country. And so we went to the big gardens like Wakehurst, and we went to the small ones like the Priory at Kemerton. But our last stop was, it's called Montesfont Abbey. It's in Hampshire.
Mm-hmm.
And like every good English garden, there's always a place for a little spot of tea in the afternoon. So while my girlfriends were having tea, which I don't drink, and they were eating scones, I found rose petal ice cream. And I adore ice cream. It's always in my refrigerator. And I looked around to ask somebody for a recipe or something, and there was nobody around. So at the time, I was the greenhouse manager and horticulturist for Allegheny County Parks, and they had asked me to start doing a little programming. So I thought this would be good. I took a bite of the ice cream, and people always say, oh, it smells good enough to eat. Well, roses really are good enough to eat. It's the essence of the rose on your tongue, and it just fills your mouth, and you're just like, oh, what have I been missing all these years? So when I got home, I started doing a lot of internet searches and found all kind of recipes, and I started, collecting some of them and writing them up, and I had a little edible flowers food fest. So I figured, I'll probably get 30 or 40 people to come, and I posted it in the newspaper, and I actually took a couple of days off with the weekend, and I came back and I had 110 people signed up.
Wow.
And the girl that I had asked to come be a speaker, she was a master gardener, and she was fairly new, and they wanted her to, go out and speak more. She thought this would be a really good idea. So I had to call her up and say, you know what, Nancy, there's like 110 people coming. And there was silence on the other end of the phone for a few minutes. Mm-hmm. And then she said, I guess it doesn't matter if I can bring one more person. And that was kind of it. We topped out at 200 every year for 14 years.
Wow.
That attended the food festival. And while we always had some standards like the rose petal ice cream, we switched it up. So, Stephen, you like nasturtiums.
Mm-hmm.
So, one year we did pork sliders with nasturtiums.
Mm.
And another year we did a roasted red pepper soup with nasturtiums, and then we would actually take a nasturtium leaf and place it on top of the soup with a little dollop of sour cream or creme fraiche on it, and Nasturtium-flower on top of it. And
Beautiful.
It's actually vegetarian. You can make it any way you want, but we had actually used vegetable broth to help thin it. You can serve it hot or cold. My husband's thought was to add a little bit of vodka to it because you could just have a new form of a Bloody Mary. Emma, you're not allowed to do that. And so, those were some of the fun things we did. But even after the book was published, we were still developing new recipes. So I just made a batch of Russian tea cakes with lavender. Some people call them snowballs or Mexican wedding cakes. They're just little butter balls with nuts and rolled in powdered sugar. And I just shipped them off to South Carolina because I'm speaking down there this weekend.
Mm.
And it's just a bite, and it's just the flavor in your mouth. It's subtle because, especially when you use lavender, you don't want to taste like you just bit into a bottle of perfume because lavender can be very strong. So you always use a little. You can always add more, but you can't take away, the flavor. So that's kind of how we got started there, and we keep on going.
Wow. Hey, well, before we move on to some ideas, I just wanted to let you know we just had an email from Ari in Aurora, Illinois, giving us a shout out, saying congratulations and that he loves the idea of the rose petal ice cream. So
and also that he wants some,
thank
and
you.
I want some too. So I think we're on the same page.
We're on the same page, and we've had a shout out from Alice. Alice, thanks for your congratulations. So now, Denise, what would be some of your top recommendations for gardeners who want to get into edible flowers?
So. One would be, obviously, roses. Mm-hmm. And you want to use roses that are fragrant. And you want to peel off the little bitter white base at the end of the petal if you're using them. And what we've done with roses, we've used fresh roses, chopped them up with some black cherries that have been pitted, and some nuts. You can use walnuts, pecans, pistachios, whatever you have, and chop them up coarsely. And then we've just done it as a chutney sauce over roasted beef, and you can serve it cold. And it's a beautiful presentation. It really takes no time at all to make. You just make it, a few minutes before you serve the beef. I love lavender. I do so much with lavender anymore. Maybe I should have named the book "Eat Your Lavender" instead. But besides the cookies, you can use lavender with chicken. And what you can do with that is, take some some lavender, and chop it up very fine, mince it very fine. I use sometimes a pair of scissors, it's easier. And you can use the leaves as well and mix it up with some honey, and then stuff it under the chicken breast underneath the skin, and just let it sit for an hour. And then you can either roast it or, put it out on the grill. And it gives it a really nice flavor, something you're not expecting.
Are you taking notes, Dad? Because I'm salivating right here over the microphone, and I'm just waiting. I really, really want some of that right now, even though I just ate lunch. You're making it sound so good.
And then bee balm is another one that's really great. So you can take bee balm, harvest the flowers, and we've actually mixed it with some butter and baked fish with it, and just put it all over the fish. And it just gives bee balm has a kind of a spicy clove scent to it, and it just gives like a white fish is recommended rather than something like salmon. It gives it a wonderful flavor.
Okay.
But since there's also salmon, what you can do is make a cold pizza. And you just get a pizza shell and bake it. And then actually, instead of, you're not using sauce, but rather you're using cream cheese mixed with some sour cream, just to thin it, spread it all over. And then you can add your nasturtiums on there. So you have the flowers and the leaves chopped up a little bit, but you have this colorful pizza that you can serve as an hors d'oeuvre.
Oh, I love the sound of that.
Yeah. I'm gonna keep you busy in the kitchen, I think.
We'll have to put recipes up on when we put this up as a podcast. I would love to share some of these.
Okay. And then, there's some like elderberries. You can make wine from them. Again, Emma, you're not allowed to have wine yet. You can make a liqueur with that. And, you can just flavor certain things. So if you grow lemon verbena, what we've done is make like a sponge cake, or buy a sponge cake.
Well, that's something I can eat, luckily.
And you take lemon verbena leaves and just coarsely rip them up and put them in a bowl of whipping cream, stir it in, and let it sit overnight in the refrigerator. Take it out, strain out the leaves, and just whip it up into soft peaks. And you get that lemony flavor, and it's just wonderful. I actually like it better than lemon balm. Lemon balm can have kind of an aftertaste with it, whereas lemon verbena really doesn't. And you can also make jellies with it. Every year there's a few jars of jelly made with lemon verbena. So, come January when you need something bright and citrusy to remind you of summer, all you got to do is get out a jar of that, and you're set.
Good choice by the sounds of it. Hey, Denise, we just had a shout-out from Brian who's saying, "Hi, I tried the lavender biscotti recipe on Denise's website. Amazing. Try it."
Yeah. The recipe itself, a basic recipe, has actually been handed down through the years in my family. And I know a lot of people cringe when they read about biscotti because they're like, oh, you've got to dip it in coffee or wine. You don't want to break your teeth. My recipe, you don't have to worry about it. It's more like a crumbly cookie. So, one bite. I still double bake it, but it's just one bite. And if you have a trick that I found out years ago from an old Italian lady is if you remember the old ice cube trays, the aluminum ones where it had the handle that you had to open that up, if you can find them in a thrift store, they are ideal for making biscotti because it keeps them all the same size. My recipe is very soft. Some of the other ones you'll see are very stiff, though. My recipe is soft. So this is why I like using that. Just put a little parchment paper in them and put my dough in, chill it until the oven's ready to go, and just pop them in. Take them out.
Okay. Wow. Well,
one of my favorites, and you've got a lot of wild blueberries up there.
Yes.
Is a blueberry lavender combo of almost anything. You can make a combo of blueberry lavender vinegar. I make a blueberry lavender preserves. And what I simply do is while my preserves are cooking, the blueberries are cooking, I gather some stems of the lavender and make sure you haven't got any little hitchhikers with you. And I actually just put a gum band around there. Sorry, rubber band. That would be my Pittsburghese speaking. And throw it in for like the last 5 minutes. And the oils just scent the blueberries. And I fish it out right before I add my pectin. And I have people who stand in line to get my blueberry lavender preserves.
Wow.
Now, Denise, do you want to remind our listeners of what your website is so that they can find some of the recipes and get a link to your book?
Okay, well, I'm actually in the process of changing my website, but it's www.edibleflowers1.com.
Okay.
You can also find my book on Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
And if they have any questions or want some, because some of those recipes were developed after the book,
Yeah.
they can also reach me at edibleflowers1@AOL.com, and I'd be glad to send them a recipe.
Now, we have to say that the book is amazing because it has all the edible flowers ideas. There's so many. There's tons of different ones, but there's also some of the recipes in the back of the book. So if you're looking to grow them and then cook them, it's such an amazing book.
Denise, before we finish off, are there a couple unusual flowers that you find surprise people?
Actually, lavender does surprise people.
Okay.
But like calendula
Mm-hmm.
I love
is one,
calendulas.
and the bee balm, but borage is one.
Mm.
And there's one, it's called false red yucca,
Yes.
and it actually is edible. It kind of tastes like a cross between corn and a pea, a fresh pea.
Oh.
And another one, it's a native plant, and I'm sure it grows for you. It's eastern redbud.
Yes.
And, you see those little bright pink, purple flowers that are all over the trunk and the stem early in the spring. They are actually edible, and I like to just harvest them and either throw them into spaghetti while it's hot, or we'll add them to, in my book there's a picture, and it's just a hard-cooked egg on some really pretty leaf lettuce on my grandmother's china, and we just have them sprinkled on them. But they're edible. They do taste like a fresh pea. I'm not a fond of regular peas, but that's actually pretty good. And what people don't realize, it's a legume.
Mm.
So, at the end of the season, you'll actually have the long seed pods hanging off of it as well. But it's one of those plants that you really, no care. It's just beautiful, and you can eat it.
Okay.
One thing I did want to point out to everybody, my book, because you can't believe everything you see on the internet. My book is actually based on university websites. I double-checked them because there were a few I had some questions about. Mine were based on university websites to confirm that they were edible. Not everybody does. I see some people posting, "Oh, this is edible," and I just cringe when I see it. But it's very easy to get misinformation off the internet. So you can go by my list. It's not a completely total list. I mean, there are others, but this is what we were limited to. So, if you have a question about it being edible, you can either look in my book or you can contact me.
That sounds good. And why don't we finish off, too? I know in your book you have a few things that people should think about before eating flowers. Things,
My rules.
Yeah, your rules. That's what I was looking for. Can you run us through a couple key rules that people should keep in mind?
A lot of times there's you go to a restaurant and they'll have flowers on your plate. They're not always actually edible. The chef puts it on because it looks good. So you'll see some of the ones that are edible are dendrobium orchids if you're in a really high-end restaurant. You will also see, I'm drawing a blank here, impatiens.
Yes.
But petunias are not edible. They're just not edible. They're a member of the nightshade family, so you want to kind of skip them. And flowers will always taste a little different depending on where they're grown, so you've got to, have that. And when you're picking flowers, if you're picking them out, on a wildflower walk, stay off the road because, frankly, you don't know whose dog was there first.
Yeah.
You don't think about it, and you never eat them from like garden centers or florists or nurseries because a lot of those flowers are imported from Central and South America. Now, if your greenhouse is organic, you're probably safe, but you can always ask because they still may buy them in because importing flowers from another country, they do have to go through some regulation before they're allowed in the country.
Right. Okay. Well, that's great. Now, we're getting to the point where we'll need to finish up. So just want to say thank you for all that great information about growing and eating edible flowers. I love the idea of that lavender biscotti.
And I'll send you the recipe for it.
Perfect. We'll put that up then on the with the podcast episode.
And then, Dad, you're gonna make something with edible flowers as soon as
He's probably gonna make the biscotti.
It'll be the biscotti. So awesome. Okay, well, thank you, and bye, Denise. Well, we hope to talk to you soon.
Thanks, Denise.
It was great talking to the both of you. Good luck, Emma, with the book.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
That was edible flower expert and author Denise Schreiber, and I totally suggest you get a copy of her amazing book, Eat Your Roses. Now, our exciting news is that our new book, Gardening with Emma, is out. It's a kid-to-kid guide on growing cool plants and healthy food, and I'm trying to inspire lots of young people, and I actually gave a talk at the Toronto Botanical Garden a couple of nights ago, and that's where I shared ideas for kids and themed gardens. Now, Finn, that's his name, was planning on growing a dragon garden. Now, that was so I had lots of different ideas in my talk about theme gardens, and then afterwards his mom emailed Dad and said, well, he wants to grow a dragon garden, so he's going to grow dragon tongue beans, and I suggested red dragon arugula and dragon's egg cucumber, and that's just the beginning, because there are so many more.
You're listening to the Garage Gardeners radio show, where we talk about extending the gardening season, pushing zone boundaries, and how to deal with garden zone envy. We talk to creative gardeners and garden experts who share ideas about how to garden longer and how to push garden boundaries.
You're listening to the Garage Gardeners radio show. I'm Emma Biggs, and thanks for hanging out with us today. I'm a 13-year-old extreme gardener and tomato lover who wants the garden season to never end.
Hey everybody, I'm Stephen Biggs. I write and speak about the food chain, farms, foods, and gardens, and I'm a fig pig. Emma and I think gardening is a great way to hang out together. We're glad you're hanging out with us too. We talk about figs in every episode, and we also talk about pushing zone boundaries. Now, one thing that I'm super excited about is the way I've been pushing zone boundaries in my garden with lemons and all the neat lemon growers that I've been meeting. And I've put together a whole bunch of ideas and learnings into a brand new book called Grow Lemons Where You Think You Can't. So my brand new book, Grow Lemons Where You Think You Can't, is hot off the press. And if you want to learn more about it, it's on my website, stephenbiggs.ca.
Now, this is the part of the show where I get to talk about my favorite plant, tomatoes. Today you're going to hear a chat that I had with horticulturist, author, and one of the team behind the amazing website, Savvy Gardening, Jessica Walliser. Now, I saw a video that she made about tomatoes for containers, and I don't actually grow many tomatoes in containers. I garden in straw bales on my garage roof, in my neighbor's raised beds, our raised beds. I have a lot of fun, but I don't do too much in containers, so I'm excited to hear what she thinks about, what some of her tips are, so I can start gardening in containers. So here's our talk with Jessica. So can you tell me a little bit about some different tomato varieties that would be great to grow in containers?
Anytime you want to grow a tomato in a container, ideally you should choose a variety that's a determinate variety, which means its mature height is determined by the genetics of the plant. So it's not like one of those, crazy cherry tomatoes that's going to continue growing all season and get just absolutely huge unless you are really, really good about pruning it. With the determinate tomato varieties, they stay genetically shorter, and so they're really the perfect choices for containers. And they come, just like regular tomatoes in all different colors, and big ones and tiny little cherry tomatoes and everything in between.
Okay. So I guess this could be a great choice for someone growing on a balcony or with maybe just a small backyard and very limited sun.
Absolutely. I mean, they still do really like full sun. They like to have at least 6 to 8 hours if possible. The nice thing about growing a tomato in a container, though, is if you have a patio that, half of it is in the shade in the morning and then that, half is in the shade in the afternoon, you can actually put the pot on like a little pot dolly or on casters and kind of wheel it over to the other side of the deck. And that really allows you to maximize the sunlight.
Wow. Wow, so containers, I guess, are such a great choice for people to grow in. So you said that there's tons of different varieties, and there's big ones, small ones, tons of different colors. What are some of the varieties that you tried, or some of your favorites?
Well, I have a lot of favorites because I grow a lot of things in containers, and tomatoes are one of my favorites. But one that I talk about quite often is a variety called Glacier that is a really nice, short, stocky dwarf tomato that gets maybe about 2 to 3 feet in height, but it produces these tomatoes that are a little bit larger than your fist. So they're fairly large. They're beautiful red, really thin-skinned, and just delicious tomatoes.
Now, you said that there were big ones and small ones. What are some of the smaller ones that you've tried?
Yeah, so I really like the tomatoes in the Tumbling Tom series. And what's great about these is they are a little cherry tomato, and they're vining, but they only get to be maximum 18 to 24-inch long vines. And so they're perfect for hanging baskets, or if you have like a raised planter or a nice tall pot up on a pedestal or something, they kind of tumble down over the edge, and they have Tumbling Tom red, Tumbling Tom yellow, and Tumbling Tom orange. And obviously you can guess the colors of each of those, but they're super prolific. I mean, they make just dozens and dozens of tomatoes through the summer.
Well, I really want to try that because I'm always trying to think of more ways to fit tomato plants into my yard. So if I could have a whole bunch of hanging baskets, I could fit a ton more, and I guess I'll just have to grow Tumbling Tom tomatoes.
Exactly. And then you can also do some kind of in-between, too. So there's a variety called Patio Princess that's really cool. That one has like what we call a saladette-sized tomato, which is sort of in between one of the big beefsteak and a little tiny cherry tomato. And that one is really prolific. And the plants only get like, oh my gosh, maybe 2 foot tall at the most. And there's a similar variety called, Patio, which is called Patio. That's the cultivar name. And that one also is that saladette size. And I really love that one too.
So that was my talk with Jessica Walser about gardening for containers and growing tomatoes in containers. And now remember that we're giving away a book today. It's called The Canadian Gardener's Guide, 3rd edition, edited by Lorraine Johnson, who is our next guest. Now remember, if you're interested in getting the book, send in your questions and comments and ideas to realityradio101@gmail.com, and remember to include your name and the city that you're writing from.
Well, our next guest is Lorraine Johnson, and Lorraine is the author of many gardening books, and she frequently talks about gardening. When Lorraine told me that she's working on a talk about rogue gardeners who push the limits of convention, I thought, wow, that's a perfect fit for our show, and looking about pushing garden boundaries. Now, I've suspected for a long time that Lorraine has a streak of rogue gardener in her. It was with her inspiration that I broke the rules and got my backyard chicken coop. And that was after I went on a tour that she led across downtown Toronto of illegal chicken coops by bicycle.
Now, Lorraine speaks and writes about a lot of native plants and how to garden with them too. And it was Lorraine who gave me the new appreciation for native plants. And one of the ones that I have a little bit more appreciation than I did is the black walnut. And that was when she gave me ink that she made from her black walnuts.
Now, Lorraine Johnson is on the line with us to talk about rogue gardeners who push garden regulations. Hi, Lorraine.
Hello, Stephen, and hello, Emma. It's really wonderful to be here.
Yeah,
thanks for
coming
joining
on
us.
the show.
Yeah. Well,
thank you.
We need to know how you got into rogue gardening and if you're a rogue gardener.
Well, you mentioned the backyard hens, and I have to say that is perhaps one of the most rogue things I have done in the garden because, of course, back when I started having hens, they were not allowed in the city. So that was definitely pushing the boundaries, and I'm happy to say that Toronto now has a pilot program to allow backyard hens in 4 different wards to try it out. So that's just one example, I guess, of the way that certain practices in the garden and in the yard can seem really out there and really pushing the boundaries of what's kind of conventional. But when people start doing that, or showing the way, or showing how you can, do things that are a little bit different, and it doesn't harm anyone, it doesn't cause problems. And so the more people who are kind of demonstrating what's possible, the more accepted some of those practices might become. And that's what I'm really interested in the garden, the ways that practices change, and the ways that things that in the past might have seemed, oh, that's just not done, now are becoming more accepted.
So the rogue might be the person that's trailblazing the way for future practices then.
Yeah, exactly. And so, you think about something like, I don't know, let's say front yard vegetable growing. And I know that the two of you are really trailblazers in terms of showing the incredible amount of food that can be grown in the city. And I guess, what's really struck me over the years is something like growing food in the city. It used to be something that was hidden in the backyard, and now it's become, because of the practices of some people who, started to declare right in the front yard, hey, vegetable growing is something that belongs in the city, and I'm going to do it right in the front yard. It's because of that sort of trailblazing that now you're seeing more people growing food in the front yard and not feeling constrained by the convention that says, no, you can only have a lawn in the front yard.
Yeah, I know when we started growing vegetables in the front yard, I was pretty worried about offending the sensibilities of my neighbors because nobody else was growing vegetables in their front yards. So, yeah.
Yes, and in fact, some people have even, they've had visits from bylaw officers over this sort of thing, or it's not unusual for the city to receive phone calls from people saying, my neighbor's doing, growing tomatoes out front. Surely they're not allowed to do that. And then they're surprised to find out that actually there is no bylaw saying you can't grow, saying that you're not allowed to grow food in the front yard. But there are certainly conventions. And but you probably found the same thing. Once you started doing it, your neighbors got interested, started talking to you, finding out more about it. Maybe have you found that your neighbors are starting to do this now too?
Yeah, there's more people doing it.
Yeah. So I think there are a lot of practices like that, like front yard food growing is something, but also let's say things like growing native plants and having a naturalized garden. There are literally hundreds of examples of gardeners who have been told by their municipality, and this happens across Canada. I know of many examples in Toronto, but there are examples throughout the country of gardeners who naturalize their yards and then receive visits from bylaw officers who are enforcing really ridiculous, outdated rules about things like, it wasn't that long ago that Toronto had a rule, and actually we still have the rule, but there's an exemption to it, but a rule that says, you can't grow anything no grasses over a certain height. Let's say it was 8 inches, 20 centimeters. And
wow.
Like that is so vague. Like I'm sure you can immediately think of all those ornamental, expensive grasses that you might buy at the nursery and plant in the yard. But there is literally, there are rules all over the country that say, no, you can't have any grass over a certain height. And those bylaws are really just used when neighbors are having a fight about something else in most instances. And so that's the only kind of outlet for the fight, to call the city and say, wait, they're growing grass over a certain height and the bylaw officers arrive.
So I guess that the solution to that would be not growing grass, but growing tomatoes or vegetables.
Good thinking. Exactly. Or, growing, let's say, there are, like, as you say, vegetables, but also like people who've put in pollinator gardens, let's say, in their yards, planted milkweed, the only known larval host plant for the endangered monarch butterfly. It was as recently as this past summer. So summer of 2018, there was a gardener in Burlington, Doreen Nickel, who received a notice through her door, and it was a notice from the city telling her that she had to cut down the milkweed in her front garden, which is a naturalized garden. It had all kinds of species in it, but the city told her she had to cut down her milkweed within, I think they gave her 7 days, or the city would come and do it for her and charge her to cut it down. So there are these really restrictive and I think environmentally really retrograde rules. I mean, milkweed, I can see it, that it might cause problems in a farming situation. So in a rural area, on a bordering a farmer's field, you can see that there might be issues. But like in a city like Burlington, there's, it's actually a good thing to be planting milkweed for the monarch caterpillars.
Yeah, and you often see it in native plant gardens that have been put into city parks. It's
yeah. And in fact, the city of Burlington being one of those, they were giving out milkweed seeds and encouraging gardeners to plant it. So it's often a matter of neighbors having a fight about something else, or one city department not really knowing what the other city department is doing.
Yeah. Hey, I just thought I'd mention we've had shout-outs by email from Bob and another one from Chase who are interested in the urban chickens and looking for more info. So I should mention that on a previous episode, we had a segment on that. So if you go to our archives on stephenbiggs.ca, we've got the podcast up there. We chatted with Signe Langford. But Lorraine, what places would you recommend people look if they want a bit of information on backyard chickens and being a rogue and having chickens in your backyard?
Well, there are quite a few wonderful online resources for people who are interested in keeping backyard hens. One of the biggest sort of discussion groups is called Backyard Chickens, and it's a North American group with thousands and thousands of members who have, and there are archived discussions about pretty well every single aspect of backyard hen keeping. So that's backyardchickens.com. But then there are also some more local groups. For example, there's a kind of Facebook group and website in Toronto called Toronto Chickens. Where and that's a good resource where you can and where you can sort of have conversations with other with people who are actually keeping hens in the city of Toronto anyway, and ask questions, find out about their experiences, read up on it. So, and I guess I could also mention, if it doesn't seem self-promoting, but just to let you know that I wrote a book called City Farmer, and there was a chapter in there about my experience keeping backyard hens that goes into a lot of detail about it and some of the myths. I mean, there are so many myths and misconceptions out there about keeping backyard hens. And again, it's like anything to do, as we talked about earlier, where you're sort of pushing convention. The more people are doing it and showing how it can be done, I think it sort of demystifies the practice for people and makes things a bit less scary. So I know that a lot of cities, and you mentioned Signe Langford, she is working right now to try to get a backyard hen pilot project going in Port Hope, for example.
Yes.
So it is spreading. The practice is spreading.
Okay.
Now, I should say, too, that Chase actually asked whether you're using the chickens for poultry or eggs. And I know when we had chickens, we had the eggs. What do you use them for?
Definitely for eggs. And this, for gardeners, there is nothing like that wonderful chicken manure.
Yes.
And I'm sure you found that as well. And also for pest control.
Mm-hmm.
The hens are out there eating a lot of bugs. I had a neighbor whose young son would bring over slugs that he had collected in his parents' garden, and he would bring over the slugs for the hens. So
I can see my little brother Keaton doing that.
Yes. So hens are great for pest control, eggs obviously, but also pest control,
and
manure.
cycling those nutrients.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Now, with back to the native plants, Lorraine, and you mentioned the milkweed. Are there other native plant gardens that you've heard of where people have faced obstacles, or other plants in particular that seem to cause unease with other people?
Yes, and strange. Do you want to know the most ironic thing is that there have been so many gardeners who are also involved with or have been on the board of the North American Native Plant Society, which is an organization that promotes the planting of native plants and provides all kinds of resources. They do a plant sale, a seed exchange. Anyway, so many directors of the North American Native Plant Society over the years have run in, and I guess because they've been trailblazers, they have run into problems with bylaw officers over their plantings of native plants. And one of the oldest examples I can think of is a gardener named Sandy Bell, who was gardening in Toronto in the early 1990s, and she got a $50 fine because of her front yard garden that included native plants. And it was a very orderly garden. I have photographs of it, and it was very beautiful and naturalistic. It wasn't sort of what you think of when you think of a wild, quote unquote, wild garden. Anyway, she took the city to court and actually won. And the judge ruled in Sandy Bell's favor, saying that she had the right to express her environmental values through the planting of native plants in her front yard. The city had to give her back her $50 and also create a bylaw that would allow for quote-unquote naturalistic plantings. So it really does go way back, the sort of ways that people have run into problems over this. So Sandy was a board member of the North American Native Plant Society, but even more recently, someone like a gardener named Doug Counter, who did a tall grass prairie garden in his front yard in Etobicoke, and then he did a native wet meadow planting in his boulevard. He, it sort of created a rain garden, let's say, in his boulevard. He ran into all kinds of trouble as well of, a disagreement with the neighbor. The neighbor, called the bylaw officers. Doug was ordered to cut down his garden full of native plants, some of which were rare. And so Doug fought right up to the Ontario Superior Court, and he also won in that the judge ruled that gardeners should be allowed to express their environmental values through the planting, even in a public place like the boulevard, which is technically city property, as long as it doesn't cause any safety issues, sight lines for drivers and that sort of thing. So a very reasonable decision. And again, the judge called on the city to make rules that are very clear for everyone to be able to follow when they do these sorts of plantings.
Okay. Now, I'm wondering too, before we finish, I want to know about people getting in trouble for vegetables, because that's the passion that Emma and I have. And I remember when my dad told me that when he moved into their first house 50 years ago, the neighbor was so delighted when they weren't Italian, because she had this association with Italians and front yard tomatoes.
Yeah.
And so it was a big concern of hers that someone might put tomatoes in plain sight. So have people been in trouble for doing that?
Well, what's interesting is people have complained about neighbors growing food, like tomatoes in the front yard and that sort of thing. But it's actually, there aren't any rules saying you can't do it. Certainly not in Toronto. There aren't rules. And
okay.
So far, I don't know of any instances of anyone who has actually been charged for growing vegetables in their front yard in Toronto, because there aren't actually any rules restricting it. But I do know that there are lots of people who have complained about others doing that practice and tried to find some reason or some way, some mechanism, some legal mechanism to make them stop. It does come up actually, though, sometimes around boulevard plantings in other cities. I know there were some gardeners in Mississauga who were planting their boulevards, and they were actually doing it with flowers, and the city, said no, they weren't allowed to. There was a bit of a, battle, and then the city decided, yes, you can plant your boulevards, but you are not allowed to plant vegetables in your boulevard in Mississauga. That's still a rule.
Well, obviously, the people who are complaining have not tasted any fresh tomatoes, because once you've tasted them, you would understand.
I think you are exactly right. And they also haven't sort of thought about, there are all these, spaces that are potentially productive in our city. Let's use them all. There's there's not enough food. There are a lot of people who are hungry, who need food, who want to grow food. And so all these places should be used.
Yeah, and I guess if you have neighbors who don't like the idea of you growing in your front yard, give them a fresh tomato or a fresh cucumber or carrot and let them try it and see how good it is, maybe.
That's bribery. Yes.
When we had chickens, we bribed our neighbors with eggs.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. That always works for the backyard hens. Bribe them with eggs.
Well, Lorraine, we're getting to the time where we need to finish up. And thank you for all the inspiration about being garden rogues. And I know as a rooftop gardener and as a front yard gardener, I hope I have a little bit of garden rogue. And certainly I think Emma has a little bit too.
Just a little.
Yes, I would say so. And I would say that you are both pioneers and trailblazers in the work that you do. And you inspire so many people. It's really great to see. So thank you.
Thanks, Lorraine.
Thanks, Lorraine. Bye, Lorraine.
Good to talk with you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
That was rogue gardener, author, urban farmer, and native plant expert Lorraine Johnson from Toronto. And we're giving away a copy of her new book, Canadian Gardener's Guide, 3rd edition, at the end of the show. And I should also mention that you should have a look at Lorraine's awesome book, City Farmer. Now, we're at the point in the show where I get to look at growing figs. This is the Bigs on Figs segment. And today you'll hear my chat with Jack Spruill. And Jack has done something really amazing. He has turned a fig orchard on his family farm into a community orchard. And it's really a beautiful story of how growing is a great way of building community. So now here's my chat with Jack Spruill from North Carolina. Jack, I understand that your grandparents purchased the farm in 1914. Can you tell us a bit about the history of the farm?
Yes, that's correct. My grandparents purchased the farm in 1914. It was I'm sure a huge thing for them. This was the first piece of land they had owned, we are pretty sure my grandfather Spruill didn't learn to read and write until he was about 16 years old.
Wow.
And we think my dear grandmother Spruill never had literacy because in deeds over the years she would make her mark where someone would normally sign. So they had been what in the South is called sharecrop farmers up until 1914. But they already had 10 children. So they had a lot of hands to help with working in the field, etc. My grandfather borrowed money to be able to buy the farm, and the oral history in the family is that World War I came along. There was a huge demand for cotton, and he had the skill and the hands to plant and cultivate, and they planted as much cotton as they possibly could. The price went up. Apparently, they had a good yield, and he was able to pay off his mortgage and bought a Model T car. So it was a great start for farming for them.
And so the farm is still in the family today, and you still have those fig trees that your grandparents planted. Is that right?
Yes, it's in the family, and it's part of a conservation project, which is another story. But we believe that the fig bushes were there. Now, whether there were as many as in later years or not, and also there were other fruit trees on the farm. The only other two things we have left from that original time era is one Kiefer pear tree, which is getting well on in years, and then a scuppernong grapevine trellis, which is in the muscadine family. It might, in fact, be a wild grape, but it was part of the family operation there.
Tell us about the fig orchard today.
Okay, well, when I first began to pay a lot of attention to the fig bushes, I counted 23. Now, some have sort of grown together and so on, but I consider there 23 discrete bushes. And they've always thrived. It was a bit of a money maker for my grandparents and for a few years after my father purchased the farm from them in 1941. But in time, the interest in families making a lot of fig preserves, you may call them fig jam, but locally called fig preserves, waned. And so there wasn't much demand for people to purchase the figs. And so my father said, okay, that's it. They're for free for everybody. You just have to come pick them. So that was the tradition for many years, including after my sister and I, and now I own the farm. That it's for free. So I guess it was a community fig orchard before we used that term formally. And I got interested in other varieties of figs in travels and you know, wherever I go and see, and people talk about, oh, this special fig. And I realized that the soil conditions and the water conditions on our farm must be ideal for figs, because we did no fertilization, no supplemental watering, and no herbicides or pesticides, just let them go. And I thought, well, if they do well, maybe some other varieties would. And most people say, well, there's none better than yours, Jack. Why do you want any others? Well, I thought, you know, if we could spread out the ripening season and have some different colors and looks to the figs, it might, you know, make it a more interesting place. Because other than the Sound Shore, the farm is best known for figs. And so people would say, Jack, I want to visit the farm to get some figs. When can I come? Well, I could give them the best guess, but I thought, well, if we can have other planting, maybe from as early as late June all the way into early October, there would always be a few figs for people to come and pick.
Okay.
If not a large quantity, but a few to nibble on.
That was Dad's chat with Jack Spruill, and Jack had turned his family farm fig orchard into a community orchard. Dad was just saying that if we're ever in North Carolina, we're definitely going there.
And we'll put up a little bit of information, a link to the website up with the podcast.
Now we chose a name out of our bowl of names here for the book giveaway. Now, Bob, you have won the book, so if you can send us your address,
Bob V,
we'll send you the book. So thank you to everyone who emailed in questions, comments, and ideas. And the Garage Gardeners show is just about over for today. We hope that you enjoyed it. Please visit us on Instagram, where we hang out as the Garage Gardeners. And you can also find me under the name EmmaBiggs_grows. Also check out iTunes and subscribe to the podcast, and make sure to review us if you like it.
Visit stephenbiggs.ca for fig growing tips, lemon growing ideas, and ideas for cold climate growers.
And we'd love to meet you in person in 2019. Our talks and events are on Dad's website, stephenbiggs.ca, and my website, emmabiggs.ca. And we'd love if you drop by and say hi if you see us. You're listening to the Garage Gardeners radio show. I'm Emma Biggs.
And I'm Steve Biggs.
Thanks for tuning in. Talk next time.
Thank you for listening to the Garage Gardeners radio show with your hosts, Steve and Emma Biggs, right here on Reality Radio 101.